Hello, everyone. Russia's war of aggression, its invasion of Ukraine, has changed everything. It's no understatement to say that many years of precedent have been written in the last few months. The EU adopted its first ever strategic compass in March and released its strengthened disinformation code of practice just this month. NATO will adopt its first new strategic concept since 2010 later this month. And of course, the war has stirred profound changes in the US defense and diplomatic bureaucracy. There are many defense cooperation issues to consider, but there are also hybrid threats, cyber and information warfare, political manipulation of all stripes. The discussion of hybrid war and fighting in the gray zone, which began in earnest in 2014, has come a long way since, and now there manifest new challenges to consider. Here to discuss them, and to discuss, too, the institutions which we're building to counter them, I'm pleased to introduce Ms. Jennifer Bachus, Senior Bureau Official and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy at the U.S. Department of State, Mr. Rasmus Hindrén on the screen, Head of International Relations of the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, and finally, Mr. Bret Schafer, Senior Fellow and Head of Information Manipulation Team at the Alliance for Securing Democracy of the German Marshall Fund. Thank you all for being here. And Jennifer, I'd like to begin with you, and I'd like to ask first how the discussion of hybrid security threats, from your perspective, how it's changed in the last few months.
Thank you for the question. Thank you for the invitation and for all the people who organized this event. I think the question of hybrid threats is one that the State Department has been addressing for many years, for decades, in fact, and we've really sort of been gearing up for this possibility since at least 2014. So for years, we've been working with the Ukrainians, with our partners and allies around the globe to help strengthen our shared collective defense against cyber attacks. So when Russia began its unprovoked attack against Ukraine in February of this year, I would say the Ukrainians were mostly ready because we had spent years working with them so they could defend themselves against the situation. So of course we continued to work with them to prepare them. What was different, though, to answer your question, is what we found was the important role the private sector is playing, essentially acting as our early warning system. We'd already seen this in previous cyber attacks, but this became even more clear in February and March of this year. I would say the other thing that's very interesting to us as we look at the current situation is the importance the Bureau is placing and the State Department is placing and the US government in general on ensuring the continued access to information for both Ukrainians and Russians. We want people to be able to have unfettered access to information, which means we need to think about our sanction regimes and other things in ways that will not impede access to information. So, thanks.
Well, thank you. And I'd love to stay with you a moment.
Yes.
And to zoom out and ask about the Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy.
Yes.
The Bureau, as I understand it, is just 3 months old.
Yes.
So what does this say about changing US conceptions of cyberspace?
So much like with the rest of these issues, there were many debates for many years in the State Department about how to organize ourselves around these issues. Secretary Blinken, when he came in and started his modernization agenda, he looked at this. He talked to the private sector, he talked to our allies, he talked to our partners, he talked to Congress, and ultimately decided to build the Bureau that exists today. We are responsible for what we consider to be the three important elements of cyberspace and digital policy, specifically national security, economic, and human rights considerations. So we bring these three elements together in order to both elevate these issues within the State Department and US government, but also to try to be more forward-leaning to think about the threats of tomorrow and how we can have an affirmative vision for cyberspace.
Well, thank you. And Rasmus, I want to turn to you now and ask the same question about the environment, how the environment has changed since the invasion, and from your perspective as head of the Hybrid Threat Center, or the International Relations component.
Yeah, thanks, Emerson, and thank you for having me. I would have very much preferred to be there in person, but it is what it is. But if we look at how things have changed, obviously there's the major focus now on the kinetic side of things, but we are definitely seeing lots of hybridity in this conflict, the way the military element mixes or combines with the information domain, with the diplomatic domain, legal, economic, and then all the things we're seeing with regard to societal resilience in Ukraine, the role of individuals, companies, groups that are playing in that conflict. On the other hand, it hasn't really changed the basics. We're seeing hybrid attacks also in our societies almost on a daily basis, and we're going to need to build our resiliences in the short term and in the long term, in a national level, but also internationally. And that's basically also the major reason our center was established 5 years ago.
Well, thank you. And I want to stay with you a moment and just dig a bit more into that, because hybrid threats before the invasion had often been a sort of bucket where one might put any issue that didn't regard kinetic military matters. I'm wondering, after the invasion, how your conception of hybrid threats has been sharpened, and if there are certain issues within this category to which you think more resources should be devoted or should be prioritized over other issues that have previously been categorized as hybrid threats?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's always been lots of discussion and debate about the concept of hybrid threats and whether it's a useful term, analytically speaking. But I think the important point is to think about the threat spectrum, the whole of the threat spectrum, which includes military means or the threat of their use, because these are used in a continuum by our adversaries, and we have to understand that continuum and how they combine the military elements with the other elements. So if we would exclude the military element here, we would just create another gap, which would make it much more difficult to counter these threats. So I think that's become even more clear in this context, even if it has been in many ways a traditional conventional warfare.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And I want to turn now to you, Bret, and ask again how the war changes or has changed conceptions in the areas that you focus on: information manipulation, disinformation, and related tactics.
I think in the information space, what we've seen is the war has made the concept of disinformation a little bit clearer and a little bit less abstract. Previously in the US, when we talked about disinformation, information threats, it was usually seen through a perspective of elections and political disinformation, and everything kind of being pegged back to 2016. This was really problematic, I think, in the conversations that we would have when we would go out across America and try to talk about the threat of foreign interference. It was always political. Now I think audiences in the US understand the stakes involved with disinformation. It has become more real. I think it has also bolstered trust in government to a degree. A lot of the trust that was lost because of Iraq, I think the IC has gained some of that trust back, both in the US and Europe. I think there's a little bit of irony there in that trust was gained because essentially what we signaled would happen happened. And of course, if you're talking about deterrence, eventually you don't want that to happen. And that creates a little bit of an ironic problem there, in that you can't keep messaging that something's going to happen if it doesn't happen over and over. At a certain point, I think audiences tune it out. It's sort of like saying a hurricane's going to hit and it doesn't hit and it doesn't hit and it doesn't hit. Eventually, people stop boarding up their windows. So I think we've been a little bit maybe too celebratory in the successes we had about messaging before the invasion. And I'm not sure we're kind of looking at the next step of how do we deter the next invasion while still maintaining that trust in institutions and the trust in the IC. And I think also, if you're looking at a little bit more pessimistic view, I think the threat environment domestically hasn't improved greatly. I think there has been renewed trust in when the government messages about a threat from China or Russia when it deals with a foreign invasion. Yes, we maybe trust that a little bit more, But when you look at what Russia does best, which is launching disinformation campaigns targeting political, social issues, those vulnerabilities still exist. So at a certain point, if Russia pivots from trying to justify their unjustifiable actions in Ukraine back to how do we try to stir the pot before a midterm, I'm not sure we're in a significantly better place today than we were pre-February 24th.
Got it. And because you and I study the same area, I'm going to ask you a tough follow-up, which is the Daily Beast yesterday reported U.S. intelligence warning that Russian disinformation might target support for the war, and in particular in the U.S. support for aid to Ukraine. What does that future look like? And how, when we talk about hybrid threats, how can we disentangle this sort of information offensive from legitimate political opposition in the U.S. and elsewhere?
Yeah, that's the challenge, and I think that's the inherent challenge of trying to frame something specifically as a foreign threat. At some point, it gets intertangled with the domestic. If it doesn't, it's not really a threat. So there's always that issue of dealing with, okay, if you're talking about really who are the influencers, they're typically going to be domestic, and if they're in some ways parroting messaging coming from abroad, there is that tendency to, I think, sort of label everything as a foreign threat, and then that creates its own inherent problems with speech and everything else. I think we're really going to see, a pivot from Russia, from, again, trying to message away from Bucha to actually going back to what they do best, which is talk about gas prices. It's to talk about domestic issues that Americans care about that will get to undermining support for the war in Ukraine without specifically talking about it. I think they have, broadly speaking, lost that battle in the US. Like, they found a little bit of a home in the fringes, particularly in the far right, but I don't think, broadly speaking, they're going to change public perception about what Russia is doing in Ukraine. What they can do successfully is attack other issues that get at the sort of core support for supporting Ukraine. And I think that's where they'll be more effective.
Got it. Thank you. And this is a US-EU conference, so I'd like to turn now to discussing transatlantic cooperation on hybrid threats. And Jennifer, I'd like to turn back to you. Just from your perspective, what is the role of the US-EU relationship when it comes to understanding and countering hybrid threats?
I would start by saying we had a lot of very significant cooperation between the United States and the EU, particularly on attributions. I could name them all, but I think most of you who are here know Viasat being the most recent one. But figuring out ways to work together to both attribute, to call out these things, to share the burden of really these terrible attacks that have happened. I would add as well, trying to figure out how we work to secure our critical infrastructure. What happens if there's an attack that has cascading effects? How do we work together? What's the crisis response mechanism that we have together? And we don't have the answers to all these. These are sort of the questions going forward that we're thinking about in my bureau. Also, there are lots of questions around deterrence. We've used sanctions. Has that been effective? Are there other things we should be doing in the deterrence playbook? And these are sort of the questions that we have to continue to look at going forward. So we have what we've done, and we have what we need to do going forward, especially I don't personally believe that this situation is resolved. I think there will continue to be attacks, and we have to be prepared to respond together.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Rasmus, to you, and the same question about the role of the US and EU in countering hybrid threats, understanding that your center has existed since 2017.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would maybe start by saying that the cooperation between the EU and US has been a bit behind the curve. The need was there since a long time ago, but some of the opportunities were not seized. But now I think, well, the need is even bigger than previously because of the growing interdependencies between the different sectors and how security policy is part of all of those issues. But now I think it's definitely improving this cooperation. First of all, there are certain mechanisms that should enable a better joint understanding of the threats and help to come up with some joint responses. And just to take a couple of examples, the Trade and Technology Council is one, and the Security and Defense Dialogue is another one. So it's definitely going in the right direction. But these should be complemented, just to throw a couple of ideas out there, these should be complemented with regular high-level meetings, technical interfaces, and personnel exchanges, things like that, to just keep building on the cooperation that has started to move into the right direction. And I think that was mentioned in the previous panel quite well, that these are similar types of actors, the EU and the US, and that fact should be leveraged. The EU has this kind of comprehensive possibility to act on several of these threats, and that should be utilized. And the EU and US could achieve a whole lot more together.
Thank you. And I know the war was a spark for many elements of these institutional cooperation. Do you think that the US-EU dialogue and coordination has improved since the war began?
Yeah, luckily some of these mechanisms were already being put into place before the war, but I think the momentum has been building since the beginning of the war, and it's definitely moving in the right direction.
Got it. Thank you. And Bret, to you, from your perspective, the US-EU relationship on hybrid threats.
Well, I'll give a shout out to Rasmus's institution. So the Center of Hybrid Threats hosted a couple weeks ago, when I went out to Helsinki, a disinformation war game that brought together European partners, American partners. We essentially sort of worked through a hybrid threat run by Russia, by China. So we're starting to build that cooperation again before it is needed. I mean, it's obviously needed now, but starting to look ahead at what could be a future threat. And so I think more of those opportunities to collaborate, to build relationships among institutions, but also outside of government. Like, I think it's very important that civil society has a role here, particularly when you're talking about open source intelligence. I mean, the work that both of our organizations do, Bellingcat and others, I mean, there's definitely a role to bring civil society into some of the efforts that are needed to fight threats in the information space. So I think building those bridges in advance is really important, so you know who to turn to, there's trust there. But I also think, and you know this well, there's not a lot that we're seeing in this war that wasn't predictable. We've seen a lot of these information threats before. A lot of them, in terms of the narratives, are recycled, talking about the bioweapons conspiracy theory. This is at least the 4th or 5th time in my 5 years working on this issue there's been a bioweapons conspiracy theory. So we've seen this all before. There are narratives that are predictable. We can get out ahead of it. And I don't just mean that in sort of the theoretical sense of let's prepare. I mean, practically, we should have responses ready for the predictable information attacks that we know are likely to come at some point. So you have some of that material on the shelf that's ready to be pulled off, and you can be very quick and very responsive and fight back without having to kind of figure out on the fly, like, what do we do now? Occasionally there's things that are unpredictable, and you're gonna have to kind of figure it out as you go. But again, during the course of this war in Ukraine, most of what we've seen before. And I think to the degree that we can prepare for those threats and actually have a response ready, that means we're gonna be way more responsive in the future.
Got it. And I have one more question for the three of you, and then we'll turn to the audience. I want to briefly consider, there's a US-EU relationship, but there's also a NATO-EU relationship. And in the recently unveiled EU Strategic Compass, there's quite a lot of focus on cyber defense. In the new NATO strategic concept, there will surely be a lot of focus on cyber defense. What can be done to prevent potential redundancy of effort? How can these organizations and components work best together? And Jennifer, first to you.
I think you have to first identify where are the areas of expertise and the functional capacity on each. the role the EU plays and the role the NATO play are different. They're just fundamentally different. And so there is definitely a specific role for the EU to play, particularly on, I would say, critical infrastructure, defense, those things. But NATO also has a role to play, and it brings in more partners to the table. And so it's just about coordination, discussions. I would also note, and actually the team had asked me to note this before, but I missed it, is the role of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which includes EU member states as well as us and others. And we have actually, we're working on a confidence building measure. And in fact, people are meeting right now to discuss how to implement these issues. So there's actually, to be honest, there's a wide range of organizations that are playing in this sphere. And we do just need to look at where's the core function and how can we each play our role and not be so competitive, but cooperative. I think that is the vision from the US administration on the US-EU relationship, as well as, I would say, the EU-NATO relationship.
Got it. And as a follow-up to that, are there particular areas where you think that the EU has a comparative advantage, sort of leading the push on the hybrid threats question? And this will be a question for you two as well.
Well, I think clearly because, so I should say, if anyone read my bio, I went to the College of Europe, so I actually studied Europe, but I studied Europe in 1997 to 1998. So Europe today is a little different than it was back then, and I just served in Prague. So I have some experience, but I don't want to pretend like I'm an expert in the EU. But from my perspective, I would say that the EU, because of the Commission, because of the way the EU functions, there are certain responsibilities that are EU competencies. So I think looking at those EU competencies and looking at how the EU organizes itself, those are the places where the EU should play a role, and then NATO should play a role in those that are more NATO competencies. So I think that's you have to look at things like, again, critical infrastructure. The EU spends significant amounts of money on things like roads, bridges, and so those are where maybe they have a little bit more knowledge that should play a role in these defense issues.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Rasmus, same question to you on duplicity of effort regarding cyber defense, and then the comparative advantage potentially of the EU.
Yeah, so starting with cyber, one of the challenges is of course that there is also a spectrum in a way ranging from, let's say, cyber crime to state-related threats and cyber defense. So there you also need to take a bit holistic approach to understand where is the threat coming from, and more importantly, what is the responsible authority to start countering that threat or that attack. So again, it takes a comprehensive view of the problem. I think part of that solution is having a sort of standardized joint approach in Europe, and that's envisaged in this new cybersecurity directive, the NIS2 directive. Another example is the EU's cyber diplomacy toolbox, which has already been used previously. But I think, as was mentioned, NATO's cyber defense efforts are critical as well, and they should be fully compatible with the EU efforts. And as far as I know, they are very well aligned. And in any case, I would think, in some ways, as I said, a duplication is even better than having gaps between capabilities or organizations. On the other question. On the comparative advantages, I think, again, it's true, you have to start with comparative advantages, look at the competencies, look at the capabilities. There was actually this conceptual model that our center developed together with the EU Commission, and there were 13 different domains, societal domains identified. And then we started looking, and the fact is that the EU is playing a role in basically all of those domains. So that's a good starting point when you consider that you need to have a comprehensive view of the problem, and you need to have a comprehensive set of tools when you start countering that problem. Again, which is to say that there needs to be this good cooperation between EU and NATO, for instance, but in this hybrid threat environment, it's good to have that kind of comprehensive toolbox. And just a final point, it's really not even possible to start isolating the individual areas or domains, but you really should need to consider all the time how each domain is connected to another domain, how they are interdependent, and how they're linking with each other.
Thank you. Excellent and well taken point. And Bret, I want to turn last to you, and then after you, we'll turn to the audience questions. So please be thinking of some good and incisive ones. We have a wonderful panel here.
So in order to not be duplicative myself, I mean, I largely agree with Jennifer and Rasmus, and I would just double down on Rasmus's point. I think it's better to have overlaps than gaps. And so I don't think it is a huge concern if there are some efforts from NATO and the EU that are overlapping in some way. I think where the EU has specific competencies in terms of defense is in the sort of psychological defense and societal resilience, and that's support for independent media, particularly in member states where we've seen some erosion there. I think they certainly have a role to play in just preparing societies for what hybrid threats look like. Sweden is excellent at this. Most of the Nordic countries are great at this. Sweden, I think, just set up their psychological defense unit. I'm sure I'm screwing up the specific name, but there are efforts being orchestrated at the EU level to prepare societies for what's coming. I think that's something that is certainly lacking in the US, for many reasons. It's very difficult to conduct media literacy to create a sort of nationwide societal resilience program in the US. I think that leaves us vulnerable. I have no idea how to fix that. But I think that's certainly an area where the EU excels.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And with that, we'll turn to audience questions. So please raise your hand, and I will try my best to get to you. Yes, miss, in the front row. And we have a mic runner that should be coming right behind you.
Sure. My name is Veronika Lapucka. I'm a Belarusian Polish expert on disinformation and media. And it's wonderful to see such wonderful constellation of experts here, dear colleagues. And I have a question to you, which I think is especially timely now. So we know that one of the way to fight disinformation is, of course, to monitor what's happening, to deal with this kind of consequences. But the other kind of means, which is very important, is also to support independent media who provide very high quality, timely, objective as much as possible information. As we are here on the EU-US Forum conference, how do you think our corresponding countries and unions, so the European Union and the US, so my questions would be probably going to Jennifer and other colleagues from the European Union, how can we support their independent media, especially in countries which are especially affected by the disinformation, Russian-speaking, also post-Soviet ones, and those who, might be more affected even more further away now. Thank you.
Thank you. And Jennifer, to you.
So I'm happy to answer the question. I should say that my current bureau doesn't work on this, but again, I'm a long-term diplomat and who served overseas for many years, including, as I just said, in Prague, where RFERL is headquartered. And I'm a big believer in the work that RFERL does around the world. They do independent journalism in places where independent journalism is difficult, and they've been on the front lines of many stories. What would be maybe interesting to talk about for you would be, in talking to the head of RFERL, is if you do a search of independent media, if you do a search on Google of something, in some places, RFERL is like answer number 10, and like Russia Today is answer number 1. And I think this is the question that we need to get to, is essentially, how do you make sure that certain stories that are actually disinformation aren't promoted? And I don't have the answer to that, I think, but it's something that I think we need to, as democracies, talk about, and we need to talk about with the tech companies. The other thing I would say is the State Department supports independent media around the world. We have lots of programs to do this. We train independent investigative journalists. We look for opportunities to support them. And to encourage them. And then, of course, through the Human Rights Report, we talk about the media landscape. So those sort of are the tools that we have to answer your question, most of which don't actually lie in my current bureau.
Well, thank you. And Rasmus, would you like to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I could maybe say that we should work on this crucial matter on three different levels. First, there's the shorter term measures. We should fight disinformation, and there are some good initiatives at the EU level as well. We should get our own narratives out. We should support independent media. All this can and should be done short term. In the medium term, we should look at the ways to regulate even the social media platforms to stop disinformation from that angle as well. And then there's the long-term efforts, which are mostly national efforts, including to educate our citizens to make sure that they're media literate and so on. But this is truly a long-term effort.
Understood. And I want to add to the question, actually, just for my own knowledge. Is there an institution within the EU now which is responsible for this sort of grant making, and is it adequately funded? This is to you, or anyone.
I would personally recommend more funding to that division, but there is this Stratcom division that also operates the EU versus Disinfo platform.
Understood. Thank you. And Bret?
Just add one comment to it. I think sometimes we put on transatlantic blinders and don't take into consideration the rest of the world, which is really important, particularly when you're talking about public opinion around the war in Ukraine. I mean, we really need to bolster, I think, the global pushback here, and we've done, I think, a very poor job in messaging to the global south over the past decade or two. If you look on Facebook, RT in Espanol outperforms Voz de America by about 10 to 1. If you look at interactions, they have about 10 times more followers. This is partly because we're just not funding our state-backed information agency the way that we should. USAGM is underfunded. Voz de America, I don't know what the fiscal year spending is this year, but it's under $10 million for Spanish language, for the entire Spanish language speaking world. So we're being outplayed in our own backyard, and I think we haven't done enough to take into consideration what we need to do to message to other parts of the world. So that would be one of the recommendations too, when we're talking about the need for independent media. Russia and China understand the importance of funding, not independent media, but getting their own media into parts of the world that frankly are media starved. And we've not really competed the way that I think we should over the past decade or two.
Thank you. And we have time, I think, for two more audience questions. We have the gentleman in the front row, center.
So I'm Andrei Bacreu. I'm a business researcher for the World Wildlife Fund. I would like to go a little antecedent to the earlier discussion that you've had at the beginning, namely, how do we kind of evaluate these in terms of jus ad bellum, jus in bellum, in terms of containment, proportional response, and whatever else. Professor Jonathan Schmidt has written an extraordinarily brilliant Tallinn manual pertaining to the norms, the possibilities, the potential outcomes, and setting up a good groundwork for what these debates should look like. However, the Tallinn manual is not being taken into serious discussion as far as I'm concerned, as far as the public civilian life at least is concerned. And also, the capabilities of cyber can definitely exceed our expectations and imaginations. I mean, for example, the American intelligence community can single-handedly shut down the entire Russian rail infrastructure within a couple of seconds, right? So we are talking about a level of magnitude of cyber capabilities which have never been actually applied, right? So how are we going to work with these unforeseen forces, unforeseen circumstances, however, at the same time having the awareness of how powerful these capabilities are and how neglected they are within this context of jus ad bellum and jus in bellum? Thank you.
Thank you. The question of norms and their application or not in the current events. And is there another question? All right, let's get into it. Jennifer?
Well, I think you know we've had through the UN, the first committee, the government group of experts, as well as the UN open-ended working group, which set up a series of norms to which most of the world agreed to and which we follow. So there has been a process on this. It's an ongoing process, but we did come to a conclusion about what is and what's not acceptable. The question becomes, as we've seen with this current attack against Ukraine, while we will follow the norms and the Charter of the UN, many times our adversaries will not. So what happens when they, I don't think it's an if, when they violate them? And I think that is what I'm saying we need to work on, because what is a proportional response, especially if it does not exceed what we would consider, the use of force. So I don't have the answer to the question, but what I think I can say is that we need to continue to work together with our friends, our allies, other democratic nations to figure out what we do when those norms that were collectively agreed to are violated.
Thank you. Rasmus?
Yeah, I think while there are several open questions when it comes to cyber, it's still, things are better when you consider cyber than when you consider some of the other domains which are lacking even some of these basic rules like the Tallinn Manual, and also there's been good work done to situate cyber attacks into the context of Article 5 within NATO, for instance, and in the EU as well. So there's work already done. But it's difficult. It's a question always of thresholds. Where is the threshold? What if there are several different incidents happening over time? And what if they're not limited to one domain, like the cyber domain? What if there are multiple events? And again, what's the threshold? What's the proportional response? And is it an asymmetric response? It becomes even much more complicated when you consider it in the broader hybrid threat environment. But these are things that we are also trying to tackle in the center, and I think there will be plenty to research in the years to come.
Thank you. And Bret, to you.
Yeah, I'll sort of look at it from a different perspective, because I think what you're talking about is an event that sort of breaks norms. But a lot of times when you look at hybrid threats, particularly in the information space, by design, they are created to exist below the threshold of response, because there's these sort of slow drip, death by 1,000 cut kind of information campaigns that are consistent and persistent. So they're not something that, like an invasion, catalyzes everyone into a response. And I think that's the real struggle that we've collectively had, is how do we respond to Chinese wolf warrior diplomats messaging consistently on Twitter over a period of time? How do we respond to a conspiracy theory that's bubbling up in the corners of the internet, where we don't want to give oxygen to something if it's just going to die there, but we also don't want to wait for it to jump over into sort of the mainstream information space. And that threshold question, I think, is a big challenge for those things that exist way below the threshold. But I don't think we've figured out when this sort of switch should be flipped, in terms of we need to actually have a coordinated response here. So that's the other side of it, is what do we do with that just consistent, persistent, ongoing efforts that just sort of chip away at democracy, as opposed to the major cataclysmic events.
Thank you. And we have time for one more quick question, or else I have one. We have a silent and thoughtful audience, so I have a question. And Jennifer, first to you. I wonder how the war has surprised or changed your risk calculus as you think about hybrid threats, and what unexpected challenges perhaps it's unearthed for the future. So a lesson learned, or how it reorients your thinking as you consider the future. And also any other concluding remarks.
Yeah, I think I would go back to what I started with, which is that these are issues that we in the US government have been concerned about for almost a decade. And I don't know that there were a lot of surprises. I mean, I'm sorry to say, but I could use a domain that's completely outside of this, having worked in Europe for many years and saying things like, energy diversification would be a really good idea, and being told like, no, it's okay, we can count on the Russians for gas. I mean, we were saying the same thing, like, oh, we really need to secure our cyber defenses. We need to get ready. There's, something could happen. We see that the Russians have done this. They did it in advance of 2014, and we didn't feel like that story was over. So what I would say is, sadly, not a surprise. I think what is, I would say from my perspective, also not a surprise, but what's been great is just the way that we've come together on attributions, how we've worked together, how we found collective responses, to call out these situations, to name them, to figure out the proportionate response. I think that those have all been really impressive conversations. I think there seems to be a lot of discussion around disinformation, which is something that we care a lot about, and how do we continue to work together to promote narratives that are accurate and to call out the disinformation while maintaining democracy in a way and freedom of speech, which is so fundamentally important to the US. So that would be my answer.
Thank you. Rasmus?
Yeah, I could just perhaps raise three interesting areas that we are very much looking into in the context of Russia's war in Ukraine. And first one is exactly the hybridity of the situation and how they're using their various tools across and in different domains. The second one is, like I already alluded to, is the role of individuals, companies, and groups in that war, which is there are threats, but there are also opportunities. And then the third one is the role of unity, what we have seen in Ukraine, the social resilience and unity, but also in the international community, and how that can be sustained and what kind of difference that makes. So those are some of the things that we are very much looking into.
Thank you. And Bret, to you, the last quick word.
Yeah, I know we're out of time, so I'll leave with sort of an open-ended question, is what do we do now? Because it sort of feels like a bit of apathy is setting in. I'm sure you were in the same boat. The first couple months, the work was overwhelming, but there was at least attention being paid to the problem, and that is waning a bit. So I think the real challenge for all of us who work on this issue is what do we do now that public attention just naturally is shifting to other things? How do we make sure that we keep people engaged and that we don't just sort of become apathetic and tune it out and turn to the midterms and forget about what's happening? And so I think that's the real challenge is what do we do now?
Well, thank you. And with that, Bret, Rasmus, Jennifer, thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you to our audience and to our hosts.